Folks, this is Tom Opre, your host to the podcast where we ask the tough questions regarding man's impact on the world's wildlife. Raw and unfiltered, we strive to help you fully understand the real issues at hand. Our goal, ensuring the world's wildlife and wildlife habitat exists forever. Stay tuned for another edition of Shepherds of the Wild.
There is another way of that this problem could be, you could initiate solving it, and it's frustrated me for a long time. You've basically got this conflict between environmentalists and ranchers over all the issues. We didn't repeat them, the wolves or whatever, the land deterioration. The environmentalists cannot take the initiative to correct it. The ranching organizations could, but they're badly led. Now, let me explain by that. If I was leading a ranching organization, New Mexico cattle growers, say, because I shared an office with them for years and know how they operate. If I was leading that, I wouldn't be in denial, as ranchers are. They're in denial about land degradation. What I would do is, as a leader, is just stand up and say, yes, we're very concerned. All our ranches are deteriorating, because it's the truth. Okay? And just say that, which is what they keep denying. And then say, we're very concerned about it. But we're also concerned because we notice that the research plots are deteriorating, that the US government put in before shooting the Navajo sheep. We notice that the national parks are deteriorating. We notice that the forest areas are deteriorating. So we've got a common problem. Why don't we start pulling together and see if we can solve it? You see, the environmentalists can't initiate that. The cattlemen's organizations could, but they're badly led, and so their leaders keep denying.
So how do we get there?
Just find a leader of one of the cattlemen's organizations who will stand up and say, yes, our land is deteriorating. We're very concerned, but we notice that yours is too. Let's get together and stop fighting.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. In Scotland, the chairman of Trees for Life, which is an environmental organization, a guy named Nigel Fraser, he's also a landowner, also a hunter. And we were introduced to him through another landowner who has a hunting facility that we showcased in the film, a sporting estate. And he was the only person to actually speak up from the environmental side and say, we got a problem here, guys. And after he watched the film, he came to me, because, he had a wildfire, the largest wildfire in the history of the United Kingdom, occurred almost literally ground zero on the rewilded lands, his and the adjacent ones that were government or charity organizations that were rewilding these things. And he literally admits that we can't get away from the fact that if we add more fuel to the land, then the threat for wildfire increases. And it was the institutional knowledge of keepers who had the equipment and the forethought to create a backfire that put out the fire. And ironically enough, as they're running their backfire, the government's helicopter tried to put water on it. But without that, he literally sat there in this sea of burned out land with every footstep puffs of the dust and soot floats in the air. He literally says, without these keepers who have been demonized in that country, without their institutional knowledge and their abilities, I wouldn't have a home anymore. And he caught so much flack from the rewilding crowd. There was even an article written about it in one of the major magazines or newspapers there in the country, and he calls me up and says, well, they've taken me out of context. And they quoted me out of context. I said, no, it isn't. It's exactly what you said in the film. He says, you need to tell your friends to back off. And I've pushed him as someone that the sporting estate should look to work with. Because they at least have some common ground.
Yeah. But you see, even if they get together without knowing what to do, it breaks apart. So there are many people, and particularly in America, who are very good at conflict resolution, and they will bring people together, whether it's families or groups. Now, I traveled with one once, very well known, renowned, And he talked to me about how successful his conflict resolution was, mostly with farm families he was talking about at that point. And I said, well, there's just the two of us talking. Be honest with me. How long does it last? And he said, oh, my God. What are you getting at? And I said, doesn't it break down? He said, yeah. It's no good getting people together to just talk. They will resolve the conflict and agree to talk together, but it will break down. Now, it will break down because they're not addressing the cause of the problem. And I told you I will sound like a stuck gramophone record. Unless you address the cause, you'll never solve it. So when those people come together, they have to agree to look at developing policy holistically, in citizen interests by institutions, not in institutional interests.
So define that, holistic at citizen interest. What exactly, give me some examples and explain to our viewers what it means to come to those conclusions.
You're asking me to describe to your viewers how to ride a bicycle. The more I explain it, the more confusing it will get. If we had a bicycle, they would ride it in 20 minutes. So do you want me to confuse?
Well, maybe some examples. I mean, of positive outcomes.
Okay, a positive outcome I'll give you because it's real. I had it in Pakistan. We analyzed 12 of their policies of the Forest Service, Bhubaneswar. They analyzed them after a week of training. They concluded every one of them would damage the forests, damage the communities, damage the economy. They concluded, so they knew how to do it. Now, when I did this with 35 members of parliament in Zimbabwe, this is published in my textbook, all right? We had total conflict. I didn't describe how to do it. If I'd described how to do it, it would have got confusing. I just did it. I just got them and said there's a different way of developing policy. So the first thing we need is to know what all citizens want. And we developed this new concept of a holistic context. New and never been in any religion, any philosophy, any branch of science. Okay, so we developed that. How do all citizens want their lives to be tied to the life-supporting environment? And once we did that, the whole attitude changed. Everybody now had a common context in which to meet their needs, solve the problems. And then I just began with questions. And I said, okay, if that's what all Zimbabweans want, and if our agriculture, wildlife policies are leading to such destruction today, and that's what we want, how would you develop policy? And they sat not knowing what to do. And I said, well, what's the role of government? What is the role of government? Who are the most creative people in the world? Are they governments? Are they bureaucrats? Who are they? Well, some of the most creative people in the world are farmers. They developed every breed of animal we have, domestic bird we have, grain crop, developed 6 vegetables from 1 weed before we had any scientists. All right, so should we have bureaucrats and academics dictating policy by government, or should we let farmers make the decision, and keepers, as you'd say, and people on the land? Well, they said, no, obviously, people on the land need to be. I said, okay, then what's the role of government in policy? Now they were confused. And I said, well, what resources does government have? Well, government has the power over the economy, taxes, interest rates, laws, regulations. Okay, how do we use these now to empower people on the land to take management actions that are in line with what the citizens of the nation need? So now we began to look at policy in a totally different way. How do we use laws, regulation, taxation, etc., make it so that it's rewarding and easy to take any action that is in line with what the nation wants and not what corporations want? And how do we make it difficult to take any action that's out of line without ever telling the farmers what to do? And we just went through like that, steadily. If I went further, it would be start biasing people towards what we did in that country, because it'll be different in different countries. But in that country, but let me just take one simple thing. Most people acknowledge today that the mass of biocides we're putting on the land is affecting us. It's affecting our humans, our testes, our breast milk of mothers. We've got plastic in our brains now. All this evidence that's doing harm. All right, so you don't want all that stuff. Now, if you don't want more government and bureaucracy, if you had a farm, let's take a farm, if I could only take one measure a year that told me the most about what you're doing on your farm, what would it be? We just got them to think about that. And after discussing that for a while, they realized it would be the quality of the water running off that land at the lowest point. If you measured that once a year, you'd know more about what's happening on that land than masses of measures you could take. Because if you've got bare soil and erosion, it'll be showing up in the water. If you've got chemicals on that land, it'll be showing up in the water. All right, so just do that. Now, if you go back to Henry George's idea of a land tax, and you have a high land tax, now you reduce the land tax, the cleaner the water is coming off the land. What will farmers do? They will decide what to do, and they will start to use less chemicals.
But that's a kind of the carrot and the stick, right? I mean,
of course it's a carrot or a stick.
Yeah.
But you're not telling them what to do, you're just making it easy to take actions that are going to go this way, and difficult to make actions that are going to go that way. The decisions are up to them, not a bureaucrat in Brussels or Washington or Moscow. Not an academic in a university that's lost touch with land and doesn't even know what science is.
I'm going to skip around here a little bit here. One of the things that we look at in wildlife conservation, wildlife management, looking at the land, looking at carrying capacity. It's something that I was taught in wildlife, conservation classes when I was in college and university. How does carrying capacity factor into this holistic management? I mean, is it a factor? And if it is, how or isn't it?
Well, it's a factor, but it's based on this business, the big error I made of trying to reduce the elephant numbers to the level the land could sustain, the right carrying capacity. It's a faulty concept when you look at numbers, and people think of it in terms of numbers. So now let me give you a real case. When in Rhodesia in the 60s, I was first talking like this, we did the charter trials. And we also ran 2 advanced projects. Now the first of these was in the Lowveld. That's down near where you went. Okay, in the low rainfall environment of Liebig's Ranch on the southern end of it. And we picked the worst land in the country. Lloyd Swift, Dr. Lloyd Swift, an American, headed a scientific team visiting the 6 British and former British territories, looking at desertification. I was a research officer in government and took him down there. He told me I was a bloody optimist because I said it's capable of we can reverse this. And he said this land is technically beyond reclamation with all the know-how of the United States, was what he told me. That's the land we picked, the worst we could find. I offered Glenn Richards, the chairman of the Cattle Producers Association, a £5 note, that's $10, if he could show me a single perennial grass in a 100-mile drive. We didn't have worse land in the country than that. So we picked 4,000 acres of that with Liebig's company, a big international company behind it, because I said to them, look, everybody condemns what I'm saying, and they wanted me to help him. And I said, no, let's take the worst land and let's do a national thing on it. If it works, We go ahead. If it doesn't, you don't waste time. And on that land, we took doubled the carrying capacity immediately in the first year, and I proved wrong. We had to treble it. We went to 3 times the carrying capacity. We ran that for 8 years. We produced 5 times as much meat per acre. The total cost was $1.80 an acre in capital outlays on it. It was run as an advanced project. It became just perennial grassland. We've done these things. Now, the reaction to that of institutions in the government was what? I took Professor Pete Boyson down there. He came up to Rhodesia. He was brought up from South Africa as South Africa's top expert on range management. Pete had been at university with me, so I knew him. And I flew Pete down there in my plane. I said, Pete, I want you to come and have a look at this before you address the conference you're going to address. And I took him there. He walked around it. We had the management of the ranch there. We had all the records, the rainfall, everything. Showed him everything. He just kept walking around it. He was an Afrikaner. And in Afrikaans, he kept saying, God, this is amazing. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't have seen it. And he kept repeating that as he walked around. I flew him back to Salisbury, the capital. The next day, he stood up at a conference and said, there's no evidence. I just stared at him. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't realize that when senior people have pinned their self-esteem to an institutional position as professor in a university, and you show them evidence like that, it's overpowering, it's overwhelming. They cannot see it or admit to it because they've pinned their self-esteem to their position.
So we're getting back to ego, what we talked about last night.
Yes. The stuff we're talking about, we've done it over and over again. You can see why I'm sick of it. I want to talk about solutions now. Let's not deal with egos and institutional crap. Our boat is sinking. Let's get together and only talk about how do we solve this, because it's easy. Managing holistically, developing policy, I can promise you, is easier than what we do today.
So just getting back on the carrying capacity, but do you have to have, in order to have a holistic approach to managing
No, a
lands?
holistic approach won't work.
Okay. I guess then the question I have is it domestic livestock that needs to be on the land because we've removed the wild animals that historically over time were on those lands? Is that the case? And do we need to bring back the wildlife, or do we need to put more livestock on the landscape?
I don't know. How long is a piece of string?
What's that?
How long is a piece of string?
As long as you make it.
You see, you asked me a question. There is no answer to that. Now, if you were managing holistically, you will solve it, because you will make all your decisions in your own self-interest towards a holistic concept. Now, if it was a national park, for instance, okay, or something like that, and you were developing the holistic context, and you said you're antagonistic to livestock, we'd say, no, take that out. If you said you want organic agriculture, no, we'd take that out. That's a prejudice. You cannot have a prejudice in the context. So you would have a context of how you want your life to be, what that environment you're managing has to be like to sustain future generations. Now make your decisions. Now, if you can achieve it with the wildlife on there, providing the physical impact, the digestive gut of the animal to cycle the nutrients, then you will do it. You'll do it. Now, if you're not achieving it, like it's happening in many parks and land around us, etc., you'll now look at alternatives. Now, what alternatives are there? All the creativity in the world, all the money in the world, all the labor in the world, and you can do nothing. You cannot even drink milk unless you go to a cow and suck. You've got to use a tool. We're a tool-using animal. All right, so if you're trying to do it with just the wildlife and rewilding, and you're seeing it's not happening, as we're seeing in our national parks, then you'll say, now what tools are available? And this is the crime I committed in the 1960s when I pointed out that humans only have 3 tools. We can use fire, we can use technology, or we can rest the land. There isn't anything else. You can, I've done it when I trained 2,000 professional people. I got them to list every tool they'd ever been trained to use in their profession, whatever university they had done. They listed thousands of things. We broke them into categories, and it was fire, technology, and rest. Now, it's impossible to solve these problems with those 3 tools. That's why I said you have no option but to use livestock. So if you find that you cannot do it with fire, technology, or resting the land isn't working, now you've got to look at the possibility of livestock. Now, when you look at the possibility of livestock, you've got to dovetail that with what's there. So in our case, we had no option. So we increased the livestock by 400%. Now, we couldn't use fencing because we've got elephants and buffalo and giraffe and so on. We couldn't kill predators because we want them. We've got lions, cheetahs, hyenas, wild dogs, leopards. We've got all of these, and we don't want to kill them. We don't. So how could we do it? Well, then we had to herd. So we did it with herding, and we've developed a way of protecting them at night, and we've produced just astounding results.
So what you needed was more additional pressure on the land being utilized.
Yeah, we needed a tractor to do it that didn't use diesel and didn't pollute. Now, what I'm talking about, all right, is something that will break the soil, something that will lay litter, something that will cover the soil. And if your animals are not doing that, and your bison can't do it on the scale you need, you've got to look at something else. Now, when professors at Texas A&M University said, oh, we've solved this problem in the 1950s, and they produced giant machines, the Dixon imprinter and various others, and these giant machines would imitate animals and crush the litter, and cover the soil, break the surface, let the water soak in. Now, those were accepted with no scientific proof, only proof by authority. I'm professor. I say it works, so that becomes science. So governments around the world, including the American governments, spent millions of dollars on these machines. And I used to fly people over New Mexico in my plane, showing them thousands and thousands and thousands of hectares of land with check dams and ripping and so on by these machines. And the machines just lying rusting. It failed totally, but everybody keeps quiet about it now. Now, when I said, by the way, machines can't digest, they can't dung and urinate, and cattle have got hooves that could do this, and sheep and goats and camels and donkeys and horses, we could use them to do this, and they also digest, they also dung and urine. Suddenly, I was like a pork chop in a synagogue, not scientific. Where's the logic?
So, but if we were to go back far enough in time, on the landscape, did we have landscapes that were healthy ecosystems that had...
Yes, and you had some that weren't.
And then we had some, but, of course, humans have had their impact but of course our population is not, it's exponentially larger in the last 300, 400 years than it's ever been on this planet. Let's talk about human population. What is that impact going to be on this whole overall, concept of managing the land, and with the pressures of all these different people, because now they live in cities, right? That's where 98% of the human population lives in. Maybe not 98, but vast majority of them. And so everything's produced for them and brought to them. They've lost that connection with nature. What is the solution for these people?
The same one as we're talking about, because you cannot maintain a city without agriculture. You've got to have food. That's basic. All right, so let's just revert to common sense. Without agriculture, the production of food and fiber from the world's land and water, you cannot have a city, you cannot have any business, you cannot have a bank, you cannot have a choir, you cannot have a church. It's the basis. All right, so now we've got these big cities with these populations, we've got to feed them. Now, what's happening is because of corporations and profit and short-term profit and shareholder values and all the stuff we know about, is the corporations have corrupted the political parties, corrupted the universities to make short-term profit. And so we've got the world being told that we can feed the cities on chemistry and technology and corporate production of food. No, that's the most destructive agriculture ever known in the history of the world. Right, so what are we going to do to save these cities? In the cities, I hear and I read papers, and I did just this week, where they say the catastrophe is coming on us and God help the poor people in the rural areas. No, these people in the cities are so ignorant. They don't realize the poor people in the country still know how to light a damn fire. They still know how to trap a rat and eat a rat even. They still know how to grow food. People in the cities can hardly tie their damn shoelaces. They're so impractical. The biggest suffering, I promise you, is going to be in our cities. As they begin collapsing, you're going to see violence and brutality that we've never seen before.
Well, we saw that with COVID, right? So COVID, all of a sudden, the grocery stores didn't have anything on the up on the shelves. Electricity, other things that people take for granted. I always use this little thing. Most of these people in this urbanized society get up in the morning, they flip the switch, they expect the lights to come on. They don't know where electricity comes from, so they don't care as long as the light comes on. Then the next thing for the day is to walk in the bathroom, flush the toilet out of sight, out of mind. And the next big decision of the day is a chai latte or a caramel macchiato. Yet 3/4 of the world, 2/3 of the world at least, don't live that way. Yet it's those people that dictate the policies on how the rest of us have to live. And that's where I see this huge disconnect.
Yeah, it is. But now again, let's not get into blaming. Because if you took the rural people and took rural communities and put them in charge of the policies, you should get the same results. Why? Because they develop policy the same way. Don't forget that when our rural populations dominated, as they did in America, it was no better. We were still heading for failure. Don't forget that the population of the world was low for most of the time when 20 civilizations failed in all regions of the world because their agriculture failed. They had low populations and they were dominated by rural communities. It's how people develop policy that we discovered in 1983. Now, if that had been discovered by a university, it would be worldwide today. But because it came from an obscure scientist with only a BS degree, we just have no progress.
So it doesn't pass muster. Doesn't pass the smell test.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, with 8 billion humans on the planet and this disconnect that exists, how do we save all these people? Or do we save these people?
I said earlier, you've got two alternatives. You can carry on as you're doing, producing good films, etc., and we're trying to do, and everybody's doing, and 600 organic agriculture or regenerative agriculture organizations are doing, and I'm part of that, doing the best we can. But I'm a realist, and I know that I've been at it for 50 years, and I know that you've got at least another 100 years before you're even at the policy table, and then you still won't be talking about how policy is developed. So I would stake my life on it that the future is going to be bloody grim. You're seeing ever escalating violence and erratic weather, etc., and desertification expanding, even in national parks. All right, so you know what the future is. And all you can do is try to speed that up and bring it from 200 years to maybe 100 years. I think we're running out of time. Now that's why I'm saying there is one other thing we can do, and that's get people like yourself behind what I'm saying and say, let's have one sovereign state just do a demonstration on the side of having people pull together and develop policy in citizen interests. Because the citizens of every country in the world want a better life need a more stable environment. So instead of arming up and building bigger aircraft carriers and arms trade and all this crap, let's just get one sovereign state and take an issue like agriculture and just have it observed and develop policy in a different way. We will facilitate that, Savory Institute, because we have the skill to do that. I don't know anybody else in the world who has the skill to do that. We have, because we've been working on it for decades. Now, we will not develop the policy. In that country, the institutions and the people will develop the policy. All we will do is show them how to do it by acting in the citizen interests to balance what the citizens want with the economy, with their environment. Their experts, their people will do it. Now that, if we do it, will offer a chance of a domino effect, because I guarantee you not a single world leader knows what to do. They need help, not demands and criticism.
You talked earlier about veganism, and we talked about agriculture a little bit. If you could condense for me, you made a comment, I think in some of your videos, about agriculture was destroying the planet. How is it destroying the planet? If you could just encapsulate that and just kind of give me an idea of why agriculture is such a nemesis to the healthiness of this planet.
Well, if you look at agriculture and why it's so destructive, let's just take America first as part of it. When I came to the United States, and the Soil Conservation Service engaged me to train people, I got the figures from them. And at that time, and this is this 1980, 81, at that time, they estimated the loss of soil from the croplands of the United States, mainly, as equal to a train load, 116 miles long, I think it was, of rail cars of soil leaving the country every day. Frankly, that is greater than all the grain, all the top, everything we're exporting. So I often ask Americans, what's America's greatest export? And they'll name grain or corn or something else. And I say, no, it's just eroding soil. It seems to me it outweighs everything else. Now, without soil to grow food, doesn't that tell you what you need to know? Now, that's only looking at soil. So agriculture is the production of food and fiber from the world's land and water. So the whole planet now is virtually engaged in agriculture, because it's fisheries, forestry, wildlife, crop production, it's all agriculture. And the whole globe is engaged in it. Now, the croplands of the world is only 6%. And if in almost every conference, every discussion I hear on agriculture, they're focusing on 6%. They're ignoring 94% of the planet that's engaged in agriculture. Now, that 94%, if you just take the land, all right, then America represents roughly the world average. 20% is cropland, 80% is non-cropland. That's wildlife, livestock, forestry, basically. And we don't spend much time on those. We spend the time on the croplands. And the soil erosion figures come mostly from the croplands. There's far more erosion on the 80% that is desertifying. So it's no mystery. If we stopped all fossil fuel use tomorrow, climate change will continue. And when you look at climate change, which is real, all right, although some people are still in denial, we are accelerating it, and almost every sane person accepts that today. Now, when you look at that, it's biodiversity loss, desertification, mega fires, fueling atmospheric goings-on, and spiraling on each other. Now, the world is focusing on get rid of livestock farting and producing methane, and get rid of fossil fuels. Well, that's trying to tackle it at the atmospheric level. No, you've got to tackle it at the ground level. Biodiversity loss. And when some of our worst examples of biodiversity loss, as we keep saying, in America, Australia, Africa, are in our national parks, that's dead canaries in the mine. Now, what I wish, Tom, and I really wish it, was I could find one scientist in the world who would tell me where I'm wrong. I haven't found a single scientist in the world that tells me where I'm wrong. I only get attacks on my motive, my character, no attacks on the work.
So when we're talking about trying to come up with these policies and bringing people into this, they bring their culture, they bring their idiosyncrasies, they bring their life experiences. Explain to me a little bit more about that process of policy creation and how the different components of it need to be. Of course, I don't have an outcome here, but just the basic of getting people together. You mentioned upstairs about having all those guys. You had all these Zimbabweans or Rhodesians that wrote on a piece of paper what their outcomes were, and they all had very similar ones.
Well, those were in America.
They're very violent. It was in America anyway. It was a pretty hostile crowd. How with holistic management, how do we talk to me about having these different people, these different entities, I assume they're stakeholders. I mean, there's people at the cultural level, and again, how do we get them together?
The only way you can get them together at the level we're talking about is a person with convening power. So that's why I say a sovereign state, government or whatever, because if you try to get them together, because of institutional egos and professional egos, they will not come together unless somebody invites them and they cannot say no. So to get them together. An example of that is you cannot get me together, for example, with World Wildlife Fund. We've tried. There was a chap in World Wildlife Fund who was very senior at Ivan Hatting. When Dr. Hatting, he was in the World Wildlife Fund at Godalming in London, and Ivan invited me to come to London to speak there at the headquarters. Ivan knew me from university days, and so I travelled to London, cost me a lot of money, stayed in my club, and Ivan came and picked me up and went out there. He introduced me to the people, and I met a lovely crowd of people, young people working in their headquarters, introduced to them all, and then took me to the lecture room where the projector was set up, etc., for me to give a talk. And they had also put a sign outside saying this talk would take place, and I gave the talk to Ivan and 6 people off the street. Not a single member of the World Wildlife Fund staff would even attend the talk in their own building. That is how great the threat is of new knowledge to egos, institutional egos, fundraising. So you cannot get us together. And we cannot, so if I take national parks as an issue in Zimbabwe, we cannot solve it in Zimbabwe. Even if the president tries to solve it alone, it cannot. Why? Because these large environmental NGOs have budgets bigger than whole countries. They have veto power. When Kenya stopped hunting, it was because of international pressure of these organizations. When I went up to Kenya shortly after that, they were telling me their wildlife population dropped by 60%.
70 now.
Yeah. Okay, that's the power. So we can't even save the wildlife around us. That's why earlier I said to you the biggest danger to wildlife in Africa, where I am, not in the tropical forests, but where I am, is the big environmental organizations. And they're getting millions of funds, and they pay obscene salaries running around in big 4-wheel drive vehicles. Now, we've invited them to our land. We got them to come one time, and the guy in charge came in a big fancy 4-wheel Toyota, and he spent his whole time glancing at his watch, waiting for when he could leave. No interest at all. So yes, you've got to get people together. We cannot do it unless we get ahead of a sovereign state. That's why I said earlier, we could begin to show a way forward if we could get somebody powerful enough to say to the environmental organizations, we need you to act and to come together with, say, the President of Zimbabwe and the people of Zimbabwe and your expertise and solve this problem together. Now, if you get them together, I can guarantee you about 80%, 90% chance of success. Because when you get people together talking as humans, not institutions, you find amazing agreement.
Yeah, we've had that happen in Montana where we had a thing called the Blackfoot Challenge. So you had all these different stakeholders that were concerned about public lands, wildlife lands, and overall forestry lands, things like that, both state and federal. And all the different groups got together, the recreationalists, the motorized recreationalists, the environmentalists, the government entities, and they said, it's what you're saying, we need to find a solution here. And so they all wanted the same thing, basically, and they found ways to make things work. And so we've had actually efforts like that reproduced in Montana in geographic areas, not statewide or anything like that. And so, and then like looking at Scotland, it's like you have these different groups of people there that have a very defined, but one of the things that was shocking, what I was told by some of the rewilding leadership, was they didn't realize, like what Dr. James Fenton had educated me on, was that evolutionary process of upper heather moorland and acidification of soil and iron harpan. And I'm like, why are you guys spending millions of dollars planting trees with tracos? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. There's no common sense to that. But there's an objective here. We're going to do this, and we're going to save the planet and all that. Yet how they get to it is the most ass-backward way you could ever think about. But it was interesting. I mentioned this guy from Trees for Life, the chairman of the board. He says, it shook me to my core hearing what was being told me, because I think on one side he realized it was right, but it completely contradicted what the propaganda he'd been told for years. I mean, he's the chairman of one of the largest rewilding charities in the United Kingdom. And he's been, sipping the Kool-Aid, right? Jonesburg. and so one of the things I've always made, and it just brings me to this point of how important it is to have different viewpoints. Not necessarily always opposing, but different viewpoints, because I think that it's much more powerful. Because, if WWF makes a film, or Safari Club makes a film, or even a government makes a film, it's financed, it's propagated, it's planned all around an objective, right? A goal. And that goal is to push out policy. And that policy, in order to get that policy accepted by people, you have to sell them on it. It's propaganda. That's all it is. It's rare that you see all these groups come together, and that's one of the things I like what we're doing, is because we don't really, I don't have an allegiance to anybody. Somebody said, well, you're biased. You're biased towards like the Scotland film, towards keepers. I'm like, how am I? The film's called The Last Keeper. Of course, it's about the trials and tribulations of these people and these communities and what's happening to them. But everybody who's in that space has the ability to tell their side of the story. Because if you don't let them all do that, then you end up into a scenario where you get stereotyped. It's one of these organizations, oh, well, you're just a rewilder, or you're just a hunter, or you're just for the sporting estates, or you're just for the ranching, or you're just for the wildlife, ranching for wildlife in Africa. It's really important that people hear, because if they don't hear from all sides, they're not going to believe it. And you have to make sure you have the right messengers. Because I found that if you don't have the right people telling those stories, and it's really great to have these rural people telling stories, because if they don't have the ability to tell these stories on a world stage, they don't have that platform. And so, how could myself as a filmmaker tell the story of holistic management in a way that is not this obscure scientist who has this past that some people don't, this new wokeism, they're going to look at it and go, well, this guy, they immediately want to discount you, they'll find whatever they can, right? And I have people attack me like, oh, well, you're a hunter. Well, yeah, I was raised by a journalist. We didn't have a lot of money, and we ate a lot of wild game, just like every human's been doing since the beginning of time. But it's everybody's always looking for that. How can we talk to these urban people and get them to understand the holistic approach in a way that doesn't come across as preachy or propaganda? What would you recommend?
I don't know the answer to that. If I did, we wouldn't be sitting here. We're doing acting years ago. I said to you earlier, you said holistic approach, and I interjected, we would be arrogant if we thought we were the first people to think holistically. There's lots of evidence that earlier people saw their connection to the environment more than we Westerners do today. You have it in North America, where apparently some of the tribes tried to think 7 generations ahead because they could see this connection. It didn't help them. The Chacan civilization failed before livestock arrived, before the Spaniards arrived. They'd killed off over 80% of the genera of animals on this continent. They talk all about bison. There used to be 3 species of bison. Where are the others? Why didn't they talk about them? You see, all that had gone already. So taking a holistic approach didn't help. It's not going to help us. It's nice to know, it's nice to talk about, etc. At the end of the day, the rubber hits the road. You have to make a decision. Every day you are making decisions. And that's what I began studying 1950s. When I first started seeing, hang on, we're setting these wild areas aside to be national parks, but they're already deteriorating. Why? And that's when my life began to change as a 20-year-old, asking that question. So that's what we need to focus on. And that means managing holistically. Managing holistically. Now, you were talking earlier about policy and how we do it, etc. And I grapple with simple ways of explaining. It's very difficult, but what we can see in hindsight now, after all these years of struggle, is that where it goes wrong is, let's say you and I, we could be brothers, we could be in the same family, whatever, but you're going to make every decision in your life to meet a need you have. So am I. You're going to make every decision in your life to meet a desire you have. So am I. You're going to make every decision to solve a problem, the headache you have today or whatever it is. So am I. Those are the 3 reasons humans make decisions in their lives every day, and institutions. Right there we've got the source of conflict. That's why even brothers fall apart. You have different needs from me, different desires from me. We're dealing with different problems, and we start getting in conflict. So what I'm talking about is, instead of, we'll never change that. I can tell you, if humans last for another 100 years or 200 years, our modern civilization, if it does, people will still be making decisions to meet their needs, desires, solve problems. So accept that as the reason for all human decisions. But it was also the context for our decisions. So all I've changed, and I, meaning working with thousands of people over many years, is discovering that, and discovering what we needed was a context in which we could meet our needs, desires, that would bring us together. So if you and I, whether we're dealing at policy level or whether we're dealing in the family, can first agree on how do we want our lives to be. We want to live with good education, clean food, clean air, freedom to pursue our own spiritual values, religions, etc. And just talk about that with no prejudice, know how to do it. And when we're very clear on that, then say, well, what would our life-supporting environment be like? We may live in a city. Doesn't matter. Every bit of food, everything we consume comes from the environment, goes back to the environment. So generically, what would the environment surrounding our city have to be? Or we may be on a farm. And we will describe it now in terms of 4 headings. How will the biodiversity ecosystem have to function? The water cycle have to function? The nutrient cycle have to function? Solar energy flow to all production and economy have to function. And we can train people to do that in a day, the basic principles of it. Now, when we've got that clear, as the environment will have to be hundreds of years from now for our great-grandchildren to live like we want to, right now, how will we have to behave? We've got to trade with other people. We've got to buy, sell, trade with other companies. How will we have to behave? Not our brand, our behavior. You're judged at the end of the day by your behavior, not your brand, not your words. So how will we have to behave? Good attitude, honesty, integrity, etc. Now, without any prejudice in that, we've got a context. Now, as brothers or parties, we can say, well, let's look at our needs. How do they relate to this? And now we begin to solve the problems together. It is that simple.
I did have a couple of specific, or a few specific questions. One of the things was humanity existing through photosynthesis. Explain to me how humanity exists when it comes to photosynthesis.
Well, all life depends on solar energy. On this planet of ours, there was no life originally, just rocks, water, etc. Now, when life developed either deep in the oceans, probably in the oceans, then invaded land, at a certain point that life, the energy for it, we don't really know where it first came from, whether it was deep thermal heat sources in the oceans or whether it was in rocks. We don't know, but we do know that the first life was anaerobic. And we still have lots of anaerobic creatures, many of them in our gut and so on. But at a certain point, life invaded the land. And from that point on, at some point, it became dependent on photosynthetic, in other words, on plants converting sunlight from energy. And then, as evolution continued over millions of years, the ecological principles, as I call them, began to develop with life and sunlight. And at some point, the bulk of the atmosphere became oxygenated, 21% oxygen as we have today. And so now most life is dependent on oxygen, and basically that's coming from a photosynthetic process. So even the fish in the sea, you find, are getting oxygen from the water, and if the water is stagnant or whatever, runs out of oxygen, they die. So I don't know how to put it more simply than basically the bulk of all life that we're dependent on, that our economies, our food, that the whole of civilization is dependent on, is coming from the photosynthetic process. Green plants, essentially, converting energy into usable form.
Yeah, great. You had mentioned something yesterday just about the pressures on humanity, especially these people living in rural areas and the rate of suicides. Explain to me, why are people committing suicide, and how is that, kind of bring it back into this whole idea of how we're managing the land.
Well, when people commit suicide for many reasons, but you tend to get a lot of it when men cannot support their families, and then for one reason or another, at that point when they can no longer support their families, they choose to commit suicide. So when I came to the United States, for example, suicide was the leading cause of death in agriculture. And that was because over that first few years I was here, over 600,000 farm families went bankrupt. Now, when 600,000 men can't support their families, yes, you get a high rate of suicide. And really that makes our work so vital, because I began training people in agriculture, bureaucrats in all the government agencies, the land-grant colleges and farmers and ranchers. And then in Ohio State University, Dr. Steiner and co-workers did a study of early adopters. These early adopters who came to me for training in how to manage resources a different way, let's put it, they studied those early adopters, a sample of them from Florida right across to California. And what she and her co-workers found was that those farmers averaged 300% more profit. And 90% of them increased biodiversity, documented. Now, that is highly significant when, at a time when 600,000 farm families go bankrupt, when in the same markets, people just getting a week of training on how to make their management decisions differently can average 300% more profit. Now, tragically, that was ignored. That's a published paper, and it's never cited by all the academics condemning holistic management. Yeah, never cited.
Conservation. It's a word that's kind of being used by a lot of different people out there. What is your definition of conservation?
What is my definition of conservation? I don't really know. I mean, we just used it when I was a kid. You had the Conservation Service, and it basically implied conserving what you have. And I don't use the word myself because I don't think we want to conserve the mess we have. I think we need to be improving things. And the term regeneration now is replacing it. But like conservation, it's becoming a word that means whatever you like. There are over 600 regenerative agricultural organizations in the world now, and most people don't know where that came from. And it came from a discussion between myself and Bob Rodale. And I had just put out a video, Roger Brown filmed it, not on sustainable agriculture, which people were talking about, but on sustainable civilization. Because our problem isn't sustaining agriculture. We could do that tomorrow if we could abandon cities. And that's what humans have done throughout history in every region of the world. As the agriculture has failed to sustain the cities, people have abandoned the cities and gone to sustaining their families or nomadic communities or whatever. But we can't do that today with the bulk of the world's population in cities. So I'd put out this video on sustainable civilization, which is what we need to be doing. And then Bob Rodale picked up on that and came and stayed with me, and we chatted and we got talking, and one thing led to another. And I loved his term regenerative agriculture, that would regenerate communities, economies, society, and thus sustain our cities. So I always credit Bob with that term. But what we actually meant was an agriculture that would be regenerating the environment, the economy, everything. Now, of the 600 organizations today pushing regenerative agriculture, I don't want to condemn what they're doing because it's from the best of motives, and they're wonderful people and incredibly creative people, but none of those organizations is addressing the cause of why agriculture wasn't regenerative before. So if you look at all of that movement, you'll find them pushing different practices, good practices that are based on the biological sciences, ecology, etc., but I'm not aware of any practice that they're pushing that wasn't being done 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. They're not looking at why did it fail in the past. What's the good of pushing it now? So we need, even in that movement, to get them focusing on the cause of the problem and looking at why did these same practices not sustain a civilization in the past. And we can do that, but we've only got one organization I'm aware of that is constantly talking about the cause of the problem. That is the one that I'm part of.
So what about wildlife conservation? I mean, what are we going to do with wildlife? I mean, obviously,
Well,
we have habitat.
Wildlife conservation is fun, but you might as well talk human conservation, because wildlife are just the dead canary in the mine. And the biggest single problem facing us in the world, I believe, is biodiversity loss. That means the loss of diversity. That doesn't mean the charismatic species, just the giraffe and the elephants and the buffalo and so on. It means all species. So when we look at that problem, some of the worst loss of biodiversity is occurring in national parks today. Now, people get puzzled when I say that, because most people go to national parks and just say it's good because it's a national park. They don't look at what's actually happening. Now, if you go to national parks in the humid environments of the world, in Britain or much of Europe, east and west coasts of America, they're wonderful. And you can't do better than that to preserve biodiversity, because what they do is what they call rewilding or conservation or protection, and that is the most powerful action we can take to restore biodiversity in human environments, oceans, seas, marine environments, wetlands, tropical forests, etc., where it's humid most of the year. Now, if you go to the bulk of the world, from right across North Africa up into China, across into India, the bulk of the United North and South American continents, where the rainfall is seasonal, that same practice is not working. It has a reverse effect, and nobody's paying attention to that.
Give me the elevator speech about what the Savory Institute is.
Well, the Savory Institute is an organization formed by younger people who rallied around the concept of this holistic framework for management that I was developing with the help of thousands of people over many years. And they rallied around that and formed the Savory Institute. I'd actually opposed that because I didn't want my name associated, but they insisted, and so it is. Because I didn't want my name associated, because nothing comes from one individual, and to me that's egotistical. But anyway, that's what it is called, and so there it is. But their purpose and why they formed that organization was to try to get the holistic framework, this way of managing complexity of culture, society, economy, nature, to produce everything we do, all the forms of food and smartphones and bombs and rockets and everything we do, to try to get that into global consciousness and into management at large scale, obviously, because that's the only way we're going to save civilization as we know it. So that's what the organization's about. It's trying to get that into the global consciousness in a timely manner to save humanity.
One of the ranchers that I'm working with on this next film wanted me to ask you this question. What is the most impactful thing you have seen come from holistic management, and what has been frustrating that people don't get about your message?
I think for me, the most rewarding thing I've seen was when I went to Australia. I had trained 2 people from Australia and said they'd gone back and started to train hundreds of people. And then my wife and I went to Australia for a book signing when I wrote the first edition of my textbook. And we were met by over 300 people from every state in Australia except Tasmania. And many people came up and thanked me, but not for saving their farm. They thanked me for saving their family. And that was very rewarding. It's about managing your life. You can't manage a farm without first managing your life, your economy, keeping yourself solvent, then managing the land to produce food. And those people had got it. So that's been one of the most rewarding to me. The most frustrating is that that something so simple has been not accepted because of academic condemnation by prominent universities in the United States, Oxford as well, etc., where those academics have never even studied the subject. If we had them talking with us here today, they would have no idea what I'm talking about. And yet they've published peer-reviewed papers saying that there's no science behind it. That's absolute rubbish. Because when we're managing holistically, what we do is get people to open their minds to all sources of knowledge, not only past knowledge, but modern scientific and knowledge to come. So how, when a management framework is insisting that people open their minds to all knowledge and not just beliefs that have assumed scientific validity, how do you say that's not scientific? It's just childish. And that's coming from eminent professors, some Nobel Prize winners, prominent people.
We talked at lunch today just about how can, looking at, how we can move forward. We talked about the idea of getting some kids involved, young adults, not kids. What do you think? What do you think we can do?
When you say what can we do, I have spent years thinking about that problem. I thought that all you had to do was provide facts and evidence. I did international trials that proved I was right. It bounced back at me. I got banned from setting foot on any university campus for over 20 years in Southern Africa when the Trojan trials proved that I was right. I got the reverse reaction. In the United States, where the government commissioned me over 2 years to put 2,000 people through training with the understanding and the agreement that if there was a big demand for the training, we would set up an American training center to further this work. Well, we had an enormous demand. I was in negotiation and talks with the Forest Service alone of training 18,000 foresters. And what we had from the same agency that set that up was not agreement to set up an American training organization, but they banned all future training. So, I've grappled with these problems all along. You talked about the Savory Institute. The initial impetus for that to come, that came from far-sighted bureaucrats in the USDA. Don Sylvester, Ray Margo, people in the Forest Service, Darrell Harrison was one there. Some of them, I remember their names still. They were part of the interagency committee. And when government broke their agreement with me, which was if I did this training over 2 years, if there was a big demand, they would set up a training entity, because I wasn't an American. I was an exile here who had special knowledge America needs. That's the category I'd come in on. I wanted to go home. Well, they broke that agreement. But at least honorable people in the USDA, like Don and the others I've mentioned, when I said, what do we do now? They said the only thing we can do is to form a non-profit, because even a president can't close that down in America. And I said, well, then do it. They said, we can't. We're government. Government can't do it. So I said, then what do we do? They said, we're asking you to do it. I said, hell, I'm not an American. I don't want to be in the non-profit world. I'm an international consultant. I've got a bloody nice living. And they said, you're the only person that can do it. And I said, well, let me think about it. And I talked to Jody about it, and I decided to commit, because this is the biggest problem we face in the world. And so the initial appeal came from them, and their actual words that I still remember were, Allan, we need you to develop a non-profit to continue this work, because it is vital for the future of the United States. So this is coming from the same men in the same agency that has just banned the training. So it's not people that are wrong, it's institutions. We talked earlier, and I said there are millions of Christians. They're capable of love and caring. But look at the churches. They go to war. They've gone to war for 2,000 years with each other. There's over 2,000 branches of Christianity. If you just take that one religion alone, is that what Christ intended? Of course not. That's what institutions do. Now you've got political parties, corporations, environmental organizations, farming organizations, and all of these are institutions. So there's no surprise that things are going wrong We've got to return to citizens' interests being predominant, not institutional interests.
So we've kind of pretty well covered most of your key stuff that you do here and that you talk about. What hope for the future do you have? What do you see in the future? What do you think is going to happen in 100 years on this planet, 200 years?
Well, the future, I think we can predict with reasonable certainty, short of an asteroid hitting us or something like that, is you're seeing it happening. You're getting ever-increasing chaos, disorganization, lack of confidence in governments because policies are unsound universally because of the way they developed. And so you're getting it in Europe and everywhere. You're getting immigration from people fleeing desertification, degradation, poor agriculture, poor policies, trying to get to Europe or America. It's changing the political face of America and Europe. And you're getting increasing violent weather. All of this is escalating. Now, it's just common sense. Unless you address the cause of a problem, you can't solve it. So as nobody is even talking about the cause, let alone addressing it, you can predict the future as much as I can. It'll just be ever-increasing chaos and drift to authoritarian governments as people seek dictatorship in the end to tell them what to do, because it gets more and more confusing. So you're going to see more and more violence and so on. Now, this is not new. We used the holistic framework to analyze policies with the government people that were training 40 years ago. And one of the things I let them do was pick anything they liked. And many of them picked this problem of biodiversity loss, desertification, fueling climate change, and they analyzed it with the holistic framework, which is an ability we didn't have before we had that framework for management, because it's a management problem, it's not a science problem. And when they did that, we only did it once. I never did it again. I swore blind I'd never do it again. Because when we did it, and this is 40 years ago, it predicted exactly what's happening today. And what I saw happen was, instead of the people doing it, the young men and women in government agencies doing that, instead of them saying, wow, we better act, we better do something, it had the opposite effect. The effect was, we might as well just carry on the party. Let's just enjoy ourselves till the end.
So basically, nobody thought they could actually affect real change.
Well, they thought it was so hopeless, you might as well just carry on the party. So that's one alternative. That's the way the world is going. More and more corporate profit, shareholders' profit, good stock market, global finance driving environmental destruction, on which entire economies, every business in every city depends. So you can predict what you like on that. Now, I am always trying to never criticize anything without putting forward an alternative. If you've observed carefully in what I say, I very seldom, if ever, criticize an individual. Because most people are good, they're doing the best they can, and their intentions are good. What I do criticize heavily is institutions, because they are not humans. The first institution or organization will be human when we hang it for killing people. We don't. We reward the top people. We usually give them golden handshakes, reward them, and the shareholders pay the price. The public pays the price. All right, so I do criticize that. And so in what I'm saying and the hopelessness of it, that is why a little over 2 years ago, I put forward a suggestion for world leaders and Prince William as head of the Royal Foundation and the Royal Society, Sir Adrian Smith, to consider. And so I put forward a way that we could solve this together, get beyond the conflict. In social media, it's the only thing I've ever put out that's never had a word of criticism over 2 years. Not one person saying this wouldn't work or this is wrong. So I've had thousands say, yes, good idea, but I've had nobody act. So I think that if we acted on that suggestion, we would have a fighting chance for young people.
So what is the call to action?
Yeah, the call to action there is just to get one political leader, because the world leaders means politicians. They're the ones who pass the laws, who license the companies, and everything else, and just get one somewhere in the world to be a statesman, rise above politics, and just not take risk, just say, I'm going to keep governing exactly as I have, because that's what the public expects. And politicians will never take risk. Okay, so just do that. Now, be a statesman and say, on the side, what I'm going to do is work with the suggestion and see if we can get our citizens and our institutions to develop a policy a different way. Because the cause of the problem is not wrong motive, it's the way policies are developed. So we're going to continue as we are, but on the side we're going to develop policy in a different way, have it internationally observed, and just see what happens. That's what I'm suggesting. Now the downside of that is nothing. $1 million wasted, a year wasted, if nothing comes of it. The upside, if people see that, oh my God, this is much easier than we thought, to develop policy in the citizens' interest, not in the interest of institutions or stakeholders, as they call the institutions, all right? And if people see the benefit of that, it'll start a domino effect, because there's not a single world leader who knows what to do. And they're not getting any help. All they're getting is demands for action and criticism.
Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.